Hello and welcome to Global Order. My name is Ishan Dhar. The jaw dropping collapse of the Syrian regime, which has come on the heels of the relative incapacitation of Hamas and Hezbollah, shows that Iran's once infamous proxy strategy is arguably failing. Joining me today to discuss his recent article published by the Hoover Institution and Stanford University on the implications of Iran's failed proxy strategy is arguably one of the finest minds working on the contemporary Middle East. Professor Bernard Haykel, who is professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University and is currently also working on a book titled The Realm, MBS, and the Transformation of Saudi Arabia. It is indeed a privilege to have him join us, and do stay tuned. This is a conversation you don't want to miss. Professor Hakel, thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. I feel like this is now becoming a bit of an annual tradition whenever something flares up.
Yeah, especially when the Middle East blows up. But it's a pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely. So it's been a little bit more than a year since the attack on October 7th, 2023, launched by Hamas. And now we've already seen Hamas and Hezbollah incapacitated. Uh, the Syrian regime collapsed just as you were finalizing this draft for your article. Did you expect, I guess, this sort of unraveling of the so-called axis of resistance to come about so rapidly?
No, I didn't. To be honest, I didn't think that the Assad regime would collapse as quickly as it did. It took, less than 2 weeks, about 11 days. And what I didn't realize, and what I think most people didn't realize, is that the Syrian army, his army, also his special forces, and that they wouldn't fight, and that the Iranians and the Russians no longer had the capacity to fight for him, which they had done before and had saved him during the Syrian civil war. So that's something that I think no one anticipated, the speed with which this would happen. And the war between Israel and Iran's proxies, Hezbollah principally, but also Hamas, as well as the attacks that the Israelis have waged on Iran itself and on their assets, the Revolutionary Guard Corps in both Syria and Iraq, have clearly debilitated Iran, and have meant that Iran doesn't have the capacity to field more people and more weapons. And then the Russians are very busy in the Ukraine. So all of that, I think, helped to unravel the Syrian regime.
Right. And you also pointed out, however, at least the proxy groups that are not an immediate threat to Israel, for example, the Houthis in Yemen, and I guess some of the Shia militia groups in Iraq are still more or less intact. What kind of threats do they still pose? And do you think Iran will start beginning to assert itself more than it already has with these groups? Say,
Yeah, so the main threat that they represent on a country like Israel is through drones and ballistic and missiles, cruise and ballistic missiles. Um, I don't. They have been weakened as well because the Israelis and the Americans have attacked both the Iraqi Shia militias as well as the Houthis. So they're still there, but Iran can no longer field. It seems can no longer field and armor the groups across what was a land bridge from Iran to Iraq through Syria and onto Lebanon. That bridge has now been severed, and so I think they're seriously incapacitated, and are in the sights of the Israelis and the Americans. So, if there is a serious movement in either Iraq or Yemen to attack Israel with missiles, I'm sure that that activity is being watched very closely, and Israel has the capacity to hit, as it has shown. The Iranians, however, still have a very major ability to disrupt matters in the Persian Gulf. So the Iranians, not only have missiles, but they have rapid speedboats, they have mines, sea mines, that could, it, you know, disrupt, for instance, maritime shipping and oil and gas, transportation from the Persian Gulf, where we have about 20% of the world's oil transiting every day, um, and that's something that, for instance, countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are extremely worried about.
Yeah, which actually brings me to the next question. Um, Correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost seems like the Biden presidency had a bit of an inconsistent policy when it came to the Houthis. At times, suspending arms sales to the Saudis, uh, taking them off the FTO list and SDSGT list, but then also making a U-turn there and now leading a 20 nation coalition in the Red Sea. To what degree did that inconsistency, I suppose, contribute to the Houthis, I suppose, now being more formidable than they were during the last time President Trump was in office?
So, you're right. The Biden administration came in, I think, largely because of an ideological orientation, as well as a very left wing group within the Democrat Party that was pushing for, a much resuming relations and negotiations with the Iranians, blaming the Saudis for the Yemeni war. And all of that changed when really it started changing before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it seriously changed after that when the Biden administration realized that if they didn't keep Saudi Arabia on side, oil global oil markets could be disrupted. Also, the Biden administration with Iran did not enforce sanctions in the way that the Trump administration did. So, The Economist has this wonderful article about the system that Iran put in place to get around American sanctions for oil sales, mainly oil sales to China. And the Biden administration knows about the system of thwarting sanctions and has allowed it to operate. All of which have given Iran and its proxies, including the Houthis, the sense that the Biden administration doesn't really know how to deter, that they're not afraid of the Biden administration, that they're not serious about um, about using force and using sanctions. And so there is an argument, and I think it's a valid argument, that the fact that the Iranians were not afraid of the Biden administration, in fact, they thought the Biden administration was almost friendly, um, meant that they pushed their advantage with the weapons shipments, with the Houthis, and thinking that there would be no consequence. Um, Even helping with the attack against Israel by Hamas in October 2023. So the world has changed principally because the Israelis have fought, and they have fought extremely ably and have been willing to take casualties and have not only destroyed Hamas, but also most of Gaza, unfortunately, killing lots of civilians in the process. They also decimated Hezbollah and the IRGC in Lebanon and Syria, and have attacked the Houthis as well. So, the Iranian policy of using proxies, surrounding Israel with what is called the Ring of Fire, which is sort of an attempt to constantly attack Israel through proxies in an effort to weaken Israel and ultimately destroy Israel through like a policy of 1,000 cuts, or a strategy of 1,000 cuts. That hasn't worked. It has backfired very dramatically, which is why now we see the Iranians are very willing to negotiate with the Americans. They've completely changed their tune on the question of negotiations. And whereas under both the Obama and Biden administration, the Iranians were unwilling to talk about their nuclear energy and weapons program or their ballistic missile program. I'm sorry, they were willing to talk about their nuclear, but not their ballistic and their proxy militia activities. Now everything's on the table again, and the Iranians will have to discuss not just nuclear issues, but also weapons development, missiles, and proxy supports.
Yeah. And coming back to the Houthis for a moment, what do you think Saudi Arabia and the rest of the GCC would expect from the Trump presidency when it comes to this problem?
Well, I mean, I think the Saudis would expect from Trump and from any American administration full support, military support, intelligence support, logistical support for any attack by the Houthis on Saudi Arabia. But you know what's just as the Biden administration did this about turn and you know initially was very warm in quotes to the Houthis and the Iranians, and then became more hard and hostile. The Saudis have done the exact turn, but in the opposite direction. So the Saudis have tried, having experienced Iran and its ballistic missiles and weapons, as well as its proxies, the Saudis have decided that instead of being very aggressive with Iran, to try to have what is called a détente agreement with Iran. And they did this in March of 2023 under the aegis and auspices of the Chinese. And the idea that the Saudis have is not that they trust the Iranians, they don't, or they believe that the regime has changed, it hasn't, but rather they want to try to build bridges to the Iranian regime, first by resuming diplomatic relations, but also engaging the Iranians in commercial and cultural and other types of activities in the hope that the Iranian regime, not this one, but with the next leader, next supreme leader in Iran, the present supreme leader is 85 years old or so. So they're hoping that the Iranian regime, because of all these new relations and because of the the kind of interests that develop out of these relations, that the regime will change, will become less aggressive, less forward leaning, and will put pressure on proxy militias like the Houthis to not attack Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis are very clear that they don't want an all-out war between Israel and Iran, or Israel and America on the one side and Iran on the other, because they believe that the Iranians, should the Iranian regime feel existentially threatened, that the Iranians would lash out at the Saudis and at the Emiratis and hit very vulnerable sort of physical installations like oil fields and oil processing facilities, as well as desalination facilities and electricity generation facilities, which means that the Gulf countries, Saudi, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, are extremely vulnerable in the event of an all-out attack and an Iranian attempt at retaliation.
Do you think there's any possibility of the Trump administration potentially putting pressure on the Saudis to abandon the Chinese brokered détente or no?
No, I don't think that the Trump administration is bothered about that particular deal. I think that the Trump administration, as any U.S. administration, would be very bothered by the development of a strategic relationship between Saudi Arabia and China. Namely, they wouldn't want the Saudis or any of the Gulf countries whom they consider to be allies. They wouldn't want them to start buying weapons from the Chinese. They wouldn't want them to develop deep technological relationships with the Chinese. In other words, anything that smacks of a strategic relationship with China is unacceptable to the Americans. A trade relationship, an occasional diplomatic relationship is, with a breakthrough on Iran, is fine. But the Trump administration will, for instance, tell the Saudis that, you have to buy American weapons, you have to buy American technology, and you have to sever your ties with the Chinese when it comes to those areas of high tech and weapon systems.
And you've talked about Iran now having a security dilemma to solve. And there are roughly two options that aren't necessarily mutually exclusive: rebuilding this constellation of proxies or accelerating their nuclear development program. According to you, both come fraught with risks. What would those risks be?
Excuse me. So I think that the Iranians who have developed this policy of indoctrinating and arming and organizing and financing proxies, the crown jewel of which was Hezbollah in Lebanon, is not going to abandon that policy. They're going to try to find a way to get weapons to Hezbollah. They're going to try to reassert Hezbollah's power in Lebanon if they can, and that's going to be much more difficult with the loss of Syria. So I think that they're going to try to do that, but it's going to take, a decade or more to be able to reconstruct what was lost in the last few months, actually. And then the question is, do they go for a nuclear weapon or not? And my argument in the piece that I wrote for the Hoover Institution at Stanford is that they will not go for a nuclear weapon. And the reason I believe they won't go for a nuclear weapon is because if there are any indications that they are doing that, they will incur an attack, certainly by Israel, and most likely also by the United States. And the United States has the capacity to very seriously harm Iran's nuclear program. I mean, to set it back considerably. This involves having platforms to deliver bombs of a certain kind and so on. The Israelis also have a very serious capacity to harm Iran's nuclear program. So they don't want that. And because, if there's an all-out war, there's a massive attack on Iran, the regime itself might be threatened. And my argument is that the regime's principal priority is the regime survival. Right. So they're not going to risk that. The second reason they're not going to go for a nuclear weapon, in my opinion, is that if they do so, it changes the balance of power within the regime. It makes the military much stronger than the mullahs, the religious clerics who run the theocracy that is Iran. And Iranian rulers, even before the mullahs, under the monarchy, were always wary of a regime, of the takeover of the regime by the military. So I don't think they'd want that. Lastly, a nuclear weapon would lead to an arms race in the Middle East with the Saudis, who've openly declared that if Iran has a nuclear weapon, they will acquire one too. The Turks, the Egyptians, and I don't think the Iranians want that. Right. So they will always try to play with the nuclear file to get leverage and advantage, but I think never actually go through with developing a bomb.
Right. And you also mentioned that Iran has effectively exploited the Palestinian rights issue for the longest time as a way of maintaining strategic engagement with parts of the Sunni world. I mean, I guess namely Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And you said, should Israel heed Saudi Arabia's call for establishing a viable Palestinian state, not would it only lead to normalization with the Saudis, with which the dividends are obvious. How could this potentially play out hypothetically? And do you think the Trump administration would perhaps be able to give the Saudis the guarantee of security that they would undoubtedly want for making a concession like that?
Yeah. So I think that, before I answer the question specifically, I think you have to realize that in the Middle East, that is in West Asia, you have two kind of ideologies or two forces or two competing kind of views of the world. There's a view that is led today by Iran, but in the past was led by other countries, Egypt under President Nasser, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and others, that basically argues that Arabs and Muslims are victims of the West and of a conspiracy that's led by Israel and Jews, that the only way to achieve liberation and development is through armed resistance and violence and militancy, kind of the classic anti-imperialist militant discourse, and that America has to be expelled from the region. So that's one kind of set of views. And it uses the Palestinian issue all the time to present its platform, its way of thinking about the world. You have another set of views led by countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, but also by the United States and to some extent Israel, that says, the problem here is not so much resistance to the West or anti-imperialism or that Arabs and Muslims are victims, but rather that you need to improve the educational system and diversify your economy and become less dependent on oil. And as it were, do in the Middle East what China did in developing itself, what India is doing now, what South Korea did in the 50s and 60s, and so on, Japan's. So a much more kind of Western-oriented developmentalist, let's improve ourselves, let's rely on ourselves, improve ourselves kind of discourse. And the Palestinian issue is always used by the spoilers, by the victim kind of narrative people. And so it retards the region. So the Saudi view is that the Palestinian issue has to be resolved, ultimately leading to a viable state. Because once that happens, the side that's always arguing that we are victims, that, Jews and Israel and the West and so on is to blame, will no longer have the argument of Palestine. So the Israelis ought to, agree and wish for a Palestinian state to exist, not because it's good for the Palestinians, but in a sense, it's good for Israel. It's a self-preservation because it stops the spoilers from ever using this issue again, like they did with the repeated attacks on Israel, including Gaza in October 2023. So that's a Saudi view. Unfortunately, on the Israeli side, there are very few takers for this view, partly because of the wars, but also because you have a swing to the right and to a kind of an annexationist, eliminationist set of politicians who don't want to ever see a Palestinian state develop and come into being. And I think the United States and Saudi Arabia are closer to each other on this than they are than the US is to Israel. And so it's important to, if you are going to have normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, to solve the Palestinian issue. and so the Saudi rulers are pushing for this. And the Saudi rulers are telling Trump, but they also told Biden that, if you give us a mutual defense agreement, a treaty that has to be passed by the US Senate, if you give us a number of other agreements on the nuclear file, Saudis are interested in civilian nuclear power as well as in processing and of nuclear fuel and enriching nuclear fuel. They're also interested in an artificial intelligence agreement with America and a free trade agreement with America and an arms agreement with America. So there are lots of things the Saudis want. We want these things and we will give you normalization, the Saudis say, if you give us all this. But the Israelis have to give some sort of timeline or some steps, irreversible steps in the Saudi view.
A roadmap to a state.
to a state. So that's kind of the vision. And that's a way of addressing the structural and ideological conflicts in the Middle East.
Now, obviously, this idea isn't popular with the incumbent government in Israel. But does this idea have any takers in Israel at all? Are you aware of?
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, if you talk to many of the former senior military officers, if you talk to a lot of the academic elite, if you talk to even former intelligence officials, they all kind of see that this is what needs doing. And there are Israelis who are for the creation of a Palestinian state, but at the moment they're not, I wouldn't say that they could gain a majority of the votes in Israel, certainly not. But, once the war is over, once things calm down, once the trauma of the wars recedes a bit, Once also the Israelis realized the destruction they have wrought on the Palestinians, because what's happening in Gaza is not often shown on in Israel. I mean, in the Arab world, that's all they see.
Right.
Um, so I think once all of that happens, I'm hopeful that, or at least I would like to think that calmer, more rational minds and a more rational approach will develop in Israel, or will come back to the fore in Israel.
That there could be an appetite for a pragmatic
Yeah,
solution long term.
yeah, yeah,
Before I get to the next question, you invoked Henry Kissinger in your article, and you said he posed the question whether Iran is a nation or a cause, and you argue
yeah,
that Iran is currently not functioning, I guess, like a true Westphalian nation state, but
yeah.
more of a cause. Could you delve into that a little bit? And
Yeah, so the Iranian regime is a regime that is theocratic and is based on the views of a former now a late cleric called Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini, who led the revolution, was the most prominent person in the 1979 revolution, had written things for many years before. And he is the one who advocated for clerical rule, for a theocracy in Iran. And that this theocracy was not just Iranian, it had an international global message of Islamic revivalism, Islamic rule, and that and there are elements in the revolutionary ideology of Khomeini that are also anti-imperialist and leftist. So his views are kind of a mishmash of, or an amalgamation of, both Islamic views as he saw them and anti-imperialist, leftist, social justice views as well, that he appropriated from Marxism and leftist movements and third world revolutionary movements. And Iran has tried to push these ideas on the entire region of the Middle East, since the beginning of the revolution, and that in doing so, it acts more like a cause than a nation, in the words of the late Henry Kissinger, and that way of operating in the world is extremely destabilizing. So if you look at where Iran has most power and influence, Iraq, Syria, until recently, Lebanon, and Yemen, these are very unstable places. These are places that are where the central state has been hollowed out, where you have militias that operate very closely with Iran, non-state actors who don't want a strong state, but rather, want to push an Iranian agenda that creates for great instability. And now the Iranians are paying the price for this policy, which is decades in the making. They created Hezbollah, the Iranians did, in 1982-83. So this effort is of many decades, and it was also intended to protect Iran from direct attack. In other words, from attack on Iran itself. And that has failed. I mean, the Israelis have now attacked Iran twice. They've knocked out the air defense capability. They've knocked out missile factories. And so, the Iranians have to think long and hard, is it worth doing this? And also, not to mention how much money Iran spends on this effort. So in Syria, it's estimated that they've spent over the years at least $30 billion equivalent US dollars. And this is money that has not gone to the Iranian people, who are not exactly, doing well economically and developmentally. So there's a serious opposition in Iran to this policy as well, of spreading the revolution.
Right. And you've written that Iran's eliminationist agenda towards Israel, as well as its implacable hostility towards the U.S., has eventually led it to sign its own death warrant effectively. And you go on to recommend to the forthcoming Trump administration that they accelerate, I quote, Iran's eventual downfall or complete transformation into what
Yeah,
Kissinger called a nation. Do you see regime change as a foregone conclusion as far as Iran goes? Israel
yeah.
keeps reiterating this as a strategic objective.
Yeah, I think the Israelis do have a strategic objective after October 2023 to effect regime change in Iran. I am not for regime change in Iran. I think that the problem with an attempt at regime change is that in any place is that you don't know what comes next, and what comes next could be much worse. For example, a regime change in Iran could lead to a civil war in Iran. That would be devastating and would have very bad effects, not just on Iran, but on the entire region. So, no, I'm certainly not for regime change, but what I am for is pressure of different kinds, including military if necessary, but certainly economic, to put, first of all, to contain Iran's ability to spread its influence, but also to explain to the Iranians that they have two pathways. If they keep doing what they're doing, they're going to get more miserable, poorer, weaker, and if they stop doing what they're doing, they have the possibility of developing and having sanctions removed and so on them. For them to do this, they have to essentially give up their ideology, their revolutionary ideology. And I'm not optimistic that they would be willing to do this. And the reason I say that the Iranians won't give up their revolutionary ideology is because this ideology is the glue, the kind of it's what keeps the elite of the regime together. It's sort of it's their Marxism, as it were, right? And they're not going to give it up easily. And I don't see a Gorbachev-like figure emerging in Iran yet. So this is a very difficult problem, and it's one that needs to be managed. And I think the Saudi way of managing it, which is basically to wager on a long-term transformation of the regime through a sticks and carrots type approach, is probably the most prudent way to proceed with Iran.
Do you have any indicators of how the Trump administration might handle this question?
So I think the Trump administration is very likely to resume what is called the maximum pressure campaign, which means not permitting Iran to sell oil at all, unlike the Biden administration. So lots of sanctions, enforced sanctions, um, arming, Israel to the teeth again, probably attacking their proxies in Yemen and elsewhere. Um, you know, a massive sort of attempt at perhaps attacking Iran through cyber warfare, just making life extremely difficult for the regime, but of course also for the Iranian people, in the hope that somehow change will happen internally. That's I think what the Trump will do, and Trump will also be very aggressive initially, rhetorically aggressive, in an effort to get the Iranian regime to be afraid and to come to the negotiating table willing to make lots of concessions.
On that note, Professor Haykel, that was most insightful. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. That was wonderful.